today I'm continuing my little series of conversations with people whose work I particularly admire. Last month, I talked to Scottish author Bill Young about his book on the Old North. If you missed that, you might like to check it out. This time, I'm excited to have Ceri Davies, who writes an amazing devotional polytheist blog called Below the Woods. And it's just filled with her poetry and her jewel-like paintings of deities. I love it. So we're in for a treat because she's going to be sharing quite a few paintings and poems as we talk about some of the Brythonic deities we both love. So welcome, Ceri. I'm really looking forward to this chat. Maybe you could start by telling us a wee bit about your blog, Below the Wood, and what led you to create it.
Hi, Chris. I started my blog in 2019 and began using it regularly in May of 2021, mostly to track the devotional work I was doing with Cerridwen at the time, and it kind of evolved from there.
So we both have close ties to the UK, in your case to Wales, even though you live in North America. You recently wrote a blog called When All Paths Lead to Hiraeth. Now, hiraeth is a word for longing and homesick, quite a strong word in Welsh. I wonder whether you could talk a bit about what inspired that bit of writing and perhaps share the two paintings which come at the end of that post.
Sure, let me share my screen. I speak in the blog post about standing in front of Lake Bala, Llyn Tegid in Welsh, and making my devotions to Cerridwen. This is one of the photos I took of being at the banks of Llyn Tegid when I was in North Wales in 2019 with my father. So I was born in Canada, but my father is Welsh, and I've always had a close relationship with him and his family and spent a lot of my childhood in the Glamorgan area of Wales. So I'm quite familiar with it, and I've got a strong emotional and sentimental tie to the land there. I devoted myself to Cerridwen in 2019 after years and years and years of seeing her as sort of a godmother figure. I thought that my life was going the way it was supposed to be going at the time, but then a lot of things happened over the next 3 years that led me to a really dark place. One thing Cerridwen had always told me was that I find Awen in my sadness and in my sorrow. For a long time, I let that kind of sorrow and madness and lack of control get the better of me. But through working with Cerridwen and, pursuing a more spiritual path with my creativity, I discovered that I can also draw from my longing for my spiritual home. So I'm no longer bound by the idea that I can only create if I'm sad. These are the two paintings I think you're referring to that I drew of Cunomaglos and Maponos. The reason I included them in that post is because when I began delving further into the Brythonic and Gaulish gods and Bronze and Iron Age culture, and even further back to the Stone Age, Paleolithic with me, I began to connect with these deities, and they began to really contribute to my spiritual growth. And I feel like they were a major part of allowing me to heal from that dark place and also kind of guiding me to where I really want to be. They are the first drawings I ever drew of both of them. Maponos was drawn in October of 2021. It was actually earlier that month on the holiday Mabon. A friend of mine had wished me happy Mabon, and when I heard that, I felt the immediate need to draw Mabon. But then I started the drawing and I couldn't get anywhere with it, just wasn't coming to me. So I left it alone as a sketch. But a month later, Maponos came to me in a dream, and I tried to work with that image again, and it just came to life. And that's when I kind of made that conscious decision to reach out both to Maponos and Mablon, that energy, because I felt it was connecting with me. As for Cunomaglos, it was right before a holiday dedicated to Epona, and I was actually working on a painting of Epona at the time. And then all of a sudden, I just felt this energy and this intense need to depict a hunter god with dogs, and his name came in my head. And I was like, okay, I guess I'm going to draw it. And I did end up finishing the Epona piece, but it was just pure inspiration that I had not expected. I didn't know much about Cunomaglos. I knew his name, and I knew that the Romans called him Apollo Cunomaglos, but that was about all I knew. I would say it was interesting that I've never really been able to replicate the feeling I got from drawing these two pictures. No matter how many pictures I draw of Cunomaglos, I never replicate the feeling that I had when I was drawing that. And I think that's just part of connecting with Awen.
Sounds like it was maybe a bit of an initiatory experience. Now, we've been, or you've been talking a bit about Cunomaglos and Epona and Cerridwen and Maponos. I think of those deities, Cunomaglos is maybe a bit obscure to a lot of people. He's not so well known. I certainly know about him, but I might just share a little bit of background about him so people know more, if that's okay.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, please.
Okay. So Cunomaglos means something like hound lord, or I sometimes like to call him the master of hounds. And some people think there's a meaning connected to wolves there. I don't happen to personally agree, but we don't really know. He's frequently, as Ceri said, connected to Apollo. And he shares attributes like hunting and healing and an association with hunting dogs, which are all kind of Apollo things too. So it's no wonder the Romans made that leap. Of course, these are also attributes of Maponos and Mabon Epmodron. I think there's probably a connection between these deities, but it's difficult to explain connections between deities, isn't it? So evidence for Cunomaglos is concentrated in the southwest of England. This is the Severn estuary here. So mostly on the south side of the Severn Valley in the Cotswolds, and also over in London. This place here, Nettleton Shrub, is particularly important. This was a major site of worship starting around, I think around AD 69, and lasting until the end of the 4th century. So that's a long time. Of course, it's likely there was something here before that. What we know of it comes from the Roman era due to the stone buildings, Roman style temple, and so on. This shows this what the site looked like at its height based on the archaeological excavations. So there's a large temple on the right. There are hostels for the guests to stay in, and outbuildings, stables, a house for the caretaker, a meeting hall. It's a proper little church camp for Cunomaglos worshippers. So this sun mask is from Nettleton. It was one of the artifacts they found. And so is this little brooch or cloak pin in the shape of a dog, which I think is really appropriate. I love that little dog. And this is a relief of Cunomaglos from Chedworth, which is nearby, also in Wiltshire. I think Chedworth's in Wiltshire. It's pretty typical of depictions of Cunomaglos as a hunter with a dog. And finally, these two are from Roman London. So he obviously had, some status there too, where there will have been some very high status Roman people living. And Ceri, I don't know whether you have anything to add to that.
I love your overview, and I think around the time I started becoming more connected with his energy, you came out with your Cunomaglos and Mabon Epmodron video. And my friend linked it to me and was like, this is the god you've been talking about. And I was like over the moon to learn more about him. I would say he's a very important god in my practice, both Maponos and Cunomaglos. I would say they tend to be my main sources of inspiration. But I was really excited that we are both interested in Cunomaglos, because it was around the time that I started, delving into him more that you came out with your Cunomaglos and Modron video. And then on top of that, I was on your Patreon and you wrote this poem called Hound Lord that I loved. And it kind of just enriched the process of creating for him in a way that I think would have been lacking if I had just been alone in this. But yeah, it was the Hound Lord poem really inspired me because I just felt like this is the first time that poems have been written about him in 1,000 years.
Um, that's really something to think about, that we're kind of out there creating art for deities that have really been quite seriously forgotten for a long time. I think maybe you wanted me to read that poem. Is that right?
Yes, yes. I would love that.
And thank you for liking it, because I didn't even remember it very much. You mentioned it to me that you'd liked it, and I was like, oh yes, I remember that. So anyway, here it is. This is called Hound Lord. I hunt the destroyer. It is my destiny to do so. Over sea, over estuary, in the river's tide, my dogs are fierce, they're fleet, they are healers. From their mouths, a chilling cry, a healing kiss. I am the son, stolen from the mother, hidden away. I am the youth, loosed to the chase, pursuing your prize. I am the poet, the singer, healer and warrior. I am Apollo and Cunomaglos and Mabon. Never the king, always the servant, ever the hero. So yeah, for all those people wondering how hard or squishy or soft a polytheist I am, I'm not sure. I don't like to conflate deities without a good reason, and I don't really conflate all these deities, but for me, they certainly kind of seem to overlap. Do you know what I mean, Carrie? Do you get that?
Yeah, Ralph Hausler, he's the academic who links up Cunomaglos to wolves. He has a theory that they were once originally the same hunting and youth deity and that they split off due to regional variations. So that theory exists, and I think that I have a much more sort of softer outlook. I call it two sides of the same coin, almost. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes absolute sense to me. And it seems for me, it sometimes it can kind of fade in and out. They can feel more connected sometimes and less connected other times. And I think, the gods are a mystery. And I don't have to understand all this. I don't have to be able to put them in little boxes. I think Celtic material generally, and Celtic deities in particular, they're quite kind of resistant to categories and that sort of thing. It bugs me a bit when people want to get too black and white about everything.
I had God of this for everyone when I was younger, because that was how I saw the world at that time. I had a way of categorizing things in a much more narrow way, but now at this point in my journey, it's much more fluid.
Celtic deities they're not going to stand for that. Having those labels stuck on them. They're much more fluid. So I want to ask you to talk more about your style of painting and drawing, and something which I noticed. So a lot of the deities or people in your paintings bear a strong resemblance to you. And I found that intriguing when I first noticed it, and maybe a little, I don't know, unnerving or something at first, but I also find it really charming. And I hope that doesn't sound too weird. I don't want to sound creepy.
No, that's,
I hope you don't mind me asking you about it.
No, it's interesting because I've heard from other artists that because we have the face we're the most used to, we tend to draw that face unconsciously. So I think I'm drawing from memory, and my most strong muscle memory is the features I have. So I think that's part of it. The other part of it is that I do kind of try to put a bit of myself into everything I paint, because the pieces don't necessarily just act as devotional pieces and offerings, but they're also kind of like a conduit. They're a way for me to connect with the divine, and the divine have spoken to me through those paintings before. The way I've always described it, and maybe this could be because I have epilepsy, so I spend a lot of time thinking about my brain, but it feels like the bundle of nerves that connects the right and left hemispheres of your brain. Like, that's kind of what my drawings are to me.
Ooh, that makes sense. I love that brain analogy. I used to work with horses a lot, and there's a lot of theories in horse training about the two sides of the brain and stuff. I won't bore you with it, but because they have the eyes on the sides of their heads rather than looking straight forward like predators and humans do. There's a theory that the two hemispheres of their brains communicate in a different way than ours do. And there's some science to back that up. So that's a really powerful image for me. Thanks for that.
Oh, of course.
So I also wanted to ask you about a recent post, Infernals of the Springtide, where you talk about your relationship with Cerridwen. And at one point you write, "Alas, my ego is burning away with the flames shining from Epona's golden crown." And I just, wow, when I read that. And then later you say this: Awen is immersed in ugliness. It is frightening. It can turn humans into narcissists, addicts, prophets, and chess masters. Awen exists in every kingmaker, every smith, in anything that inspires one to create something. I just love that because it reminds us that Awen is a creative force, but it isn't creating just pretty things. Awen,
Yeah.
it can be kind of a dangerous force, and yet it's in everything. It's never boring. I don't know whether you brought those drawings from that post, or if you could say a bit more about that post,
Yes,
that'd be great.
I do have some of the drawings. So that kind of goes back to what I was talking about in my post about Hiraeth, where my source of Awen tends to be kind of a dark place. I know I'm not alone in that. I think that for a lot of people, especially creative people, we get ourselves into dark places, whether by our own fault or not. We find the crevices and cracks and everything, and that's part of the creative process. This was a conversation I was having with Cerridwen, where I was kind of talking to her about the loss of my ego. I was going through a period of time where I felt that the conceptions I had of myself and of who I was were being burned away and rebuilt, but the rebuilding hadn't begun yet. I felt very self-conscious about things that I am normally a little more confident about. I felt immature and childish and a host of other emotions. No matter where I looked, things seemed dark. And I reached out to Cerridwen with that statement because I felt like sometimes when things shine so brightly, it can be blinding and we can't reach for it. The message I had gotten from Maponos was to take things into my own hands and trust myself with the process instead of relying on one of them for guidance or help. And I didn't intend to reach out to Cerridwen. I have a series of poems I write about kind of venturing to that dark place. I kind of call it my underworld. And when I go there, I often write a poem about it to kind of achieve some form of catharsis for the existential dread it puts me in. And oftentimes I will end up conversing with a deity or a spirit who kind of talks me through the frightening thoughts I'm having. And this one, I was not necessarily reaching out to Cerridwen at first. I was just writing that I felt the way I did. And all of a sudden, Cerridwen's energy just came and made me feel less alone. when she told me that about Awen, I felt much more secure in myself.
Yeah, that makes sense. I this word infernals, I've just been working on a big video about the tablet of Chamalier. And
Yes,
there's
I
there's
know
a
that one.
yeah. So there's a word there, which is some of the translators translate as infernal or infernals. And I always feel that word needs a whole lot of unpicking for the average English speaker, because we have this association, which is actually, this only starts in the 19th century, between infernal and the Christian idea of hell and flames. So the word infernal has nothing to do with heat or flames or anything. It simply means the underworld. I always kind of cringe when I read those translations because I think they're going to be misinterpreted, and that people see it as calling on demons or something like that. How do you see that word? You've used the word infernals. I'm thinking you're a bit more clued up, but how do you see that word?
It holds the memories of everything that's ever lived on this planet. And it's the fact that it holds all the plenty that has survived on this planet and all the knowledge and all the memories of this planet, that it's like to venture there is just like an overload of knowledge that it almost stops us in our tracks because it's just too much for the human mind to comprehend. And that to me is the underworld. So I don't know if that's congruent with other pagans' views of the underworld, but to me, it just means below the earth. And I do associate Maponos with the underworld, but I associate him with my idea of the underworld, which is a little more, is a little less traditional.
But I think it makes perfect sense that Maponos at Chamalier especially would be associated with the underworld, because it's a spring, it's coming up out of the earth. So of course he would be associated, if he's associated with that spring. And it's a little bit like, lake maidens coming out of lakes in Wales, in Welsh folklore. That's obviously at least one part of what Annwfn is. Maybe
Yeah.
not the only thing, because it can be. I mean, the Annwfn of Awen that Puig visits in the first branch. It's a very bright, sunny, wonderful, enjoyable place, and that I think that's what I'm concerned, is that people want to see the underworld, or they can't help but see the underworld as always kind of dark and terrible and full of monsters. And I don't think it's only that. I know it can be, because it's the totality of everything is what you're saying.
So if you think about it, in painting, the more colors you mix together, the darker and more muddy it gets, and the closer to the color of the earth it becomes. The more memories, the more lives, the more living organisms. It's a lot for a tiny human.
When you talk about it being everything, and that I can hear Taliesin listing his hundreds of things that I have been,
Exactly.
I've been a drop of water. I've been a page in a book. I've been, an axe in a hand. I've been this animal and that mountain. And it's a lot to take on board for a puny little human, isn't it? It's wonderful.
Yeah. That's kind of how I see it. And so like you said, it makes sense to me that Maponos would be associated with the spring, with life coming out of the earth. I kind of associate him with the beginning of things, but that is that's my personal gnosis, which I should probably get into later.
Well, it kind of makes sense. I mean, he's often portrayed as a youth, so
Yeah.
that's with the whole beginning of things, doesn't it? Even as an infant sometimes. Maybe we should just talk a little bit about you and Cerridwen. So you told me that you're named after Cerridwen.
Yes.
And that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's how I learned about her actually. My parents named me after her. They're not religious, they're agnostic, but they thought it was a pretty name. And everyone mispronounced it growing up in Canada. So I didn't like my name. I wanted to change it. And my mom used to always tell me, "Oh, but you're named after the goddess of poetry. You know, you should like your name." So from a very early age, I kind of recognized the idea of a goddess named Cerridwen. And so even though there were a lot of Christian influences around me and people attempted to recruit me into their churches, I couldn't shake the idea that there was this goddess named Cerridwen and she had to exist. So she's kind of been with me for most of my life.
So you wrote another one about Cerridwen called Adventures in Alliterative Verse that I really like. Part of what you were talking about was learning the poetic skill of brevity and paring things down to the minimum words necessary to do the job. So as a poet, and I'm also getting ready to teach a little poetry class for the first time, I thought the way you explained your process was great. I don't know whether you've got more to say about that, but I think you've maybe got a bit of alliterative verse to share, or I'm not sure what you've planned.
I started writing alliterative verse in April 2022, when I was writing a poem with Cunomaglos about the fall of Roman Britain. And that was the style that I was fascinated by. Because up until then, I'd only been writing poetry for a couple of months and I was insistent on rhyming everything, which I still did in most of my alliterative verse poems, but I wanted to experiment and explore different genres and different styles of narration. So I had some automatic writing I'd done with Cunomaglos about the fall of Roman Britain, and it was quite incoherent. And so I kind of used that sieving method to find the certain words that were kind of like the grains, separating the grains from the chaff, I guess you would say. Something I associate Cerridwen with is sieving the grains of Awen. So that's kind of what I did. And I do have the first verse of that one poem Cunomaglos and I were writing here. Down into dark age dreariness I run, nettles ever nailing nighttime spun. Barren branches stretched from brambles grown, wildly wandering the wasteland alone. Merrily they go, the gods have gone, hidden by the hearth, heretic song. Around the seasons turn my standing stones, sun rays slumbering softly in my bones. Yet behold, my bated breath bestows the coals, burning bright and bitter cold. Seldom ever can I save their souls, for Inferno's ghost are gilded gold.
That's just so balanced. I really like that. Thank you.
Thank you. It's technically alliterative revival, and it uses this type of technique called the bob and wheel at the end, which is the style that Gawain and the Green Knight is written in. And that was kind of my inspiration in terms of style, which is why the sentences are a bit longer and I think a bit more fluid than it would be if it was like strict alliterative verse. Yeah, I'm glad that it works, because I always get nervous with it because I have another poem I did in alliterative verse with Cunomaglos and it's really long and I've never gotten to a point where I'm happy with it because it just seems to be too much.
I like quite a lot of alliteration. I didn't mean to sound like I don't like it. I think sometimes I'm self-conscious about using too much, and people will think I'm trying to write a tongue twister.
Oh,
Can you read that other one that I saw it up on the screen and then you went to this?
yes. So this is the poem in the entry. This is the poem I come up with from the prose. When he wakes in waters cold, Habrena's haunting home foretold, salmon splashing swim upstream, as snowdrifts sparkle by sunrise gleam. Child of clearness, child of light, wildly wandering through the frost so white, from earth and equines his errand stray, left lost and long from lightning's ray.
Oh, lovely. And there's an equine mention in there. And I was so
Yes.
happy to find Epona and Rhiannon in your work too. I've been deeply involved with them for years. So I'm hoping you might read your poem about Epona called Spectral Hunt. Would you do
Sure. Absolutely. Her leaves, peridot green as finest jewels, soon crisp to golden skin and then to rust. Bare branches stretch to greet the foals and mules, winter's bite tarnishing the once lush crust. Beneath the hardened earth are nestled roots, with nerves and veins of mushrooms drawing close, to whisper stories to the fallen fruits, and beckon souls to break free from their dose. Yet on the winding path at riverside, procession glistens in the dimming eve. The snowfall warms as fresh burnt ashes glide among the hoofbeats thundering to cleave, beckoning the song of a forlorn sun, beckoning forth a cycle never done.
Hmm. So I noticed that one of your other horse paintings does a very cool thing. I think, yeah, you've got it on the screen now. That's the one I mean, where the horse's mane is like little balls or baubles. And I know this is riffing on images of horses found on Celtic coins, like the ones you've got there. I've got some images too. So I've got some images here so that the listener can get what I'm talking about. You can see how the horse's mane on a couple of these coins is depicted. You might be a braided mane, perhaps. Sometimes they might look a little like that. But now I'll end my share and you can share yours and show us that painting.
So this is actually for a oracle card deck I made. It's in collaboration with Branos Carnito Druidon, who created a Gaulish rune system, and I did an oracle card version of it. And this is for Epos, which is horse. And so I was inspired by the Celtic coins of horses to try and emulate that style. It's been a little dream of mine to kind of develop like a folk art type style that I can illustrate Celtic myths in. I think that'd be a lot of fun. And this was kind of the starting of that, was starting to really look into Celtic coins and kind of understand the way they use shape to define different images and figures.
I think you would be a great illustrator for myths. And we've been kind of kicking around the possibility of doing a collaboration on a video or two or something. And yeah, I'm looking forward to getting more deeply into that.
Absolutely.
I'm going to share my screen again. So when I'm teaching about the horse goddesses, I always use these coins to contrast how wild these women look compared to the very sedate, Romanized depictions of the goddess Epona. And we wonder, well, what happened? And what happened to this free woman? I mean, so free that she's naked riding a horse. I mean, I love this little statue. This is one of my favorite depictions of Epona, this one from Alasia. But she's very meek and ladylike. What happened to the other woman? Because this is normally what we see, this kind of depiction. And this is kind of my way of introducing a poem. You asked me if I'd read a poem about Epona. And this poem is about that contrast between the wild Celtic women on those coins and Epona. And I also bring in Rhiannon at the end because she seems to have a little bit of both in her. She appears as a noblewoman riding a white horse in a beautiful white dress, but I sense that there's something of the wild Celtic warrior woman, the exuberant, naked rider, kind of boiling under the surface of Rhiannon, with her sharp retorts and her, you can't catch her and that sort of thing, although she's very ladylike. So this is a poem called Her Horse Steps Proudly. Her horse steps proudly, a palfrey, smooth walking, saving from spillage the basket of bread she carries, saving her hair in its respectable coif from disarray, from any hint of wildness. She seems to be a matron, tamed and civilized, berobed and harmless, her sweet, benign face placid as she sits modestly aside on her level-headed steed. But there comes another rider now, shining like the sun she is, her face 1,000 beauties. All the long history of her boils under the surface of that countenance, like sun and clouds before thunder. Her horse is walking too, its energy barely contained. Together, they remember a time when they galloped naked and careless, when horse and mother and God were a feeling, not a liturgy.
That's so lovely. Thank you. That's beautiful.
Thanks. So I knew about your blog maybe a year ago, and then I kind of lost track of it and I didn't see you. And it was a post you wrote about the new worm moon, the February new moon. Is that right? It's February, I think. That made me take a deeper look at your work. And that post features an astounding painting of Maponos and a brilliant poem to go with it. So I hope we're going to get a look at that piece of art.
Yes.
And I know it's quite a long poem, and I don't mind if you want to read it all at all, but if you don't, I hope you'll read some of it for us anyway, and maybe talk about the painting.